When I mark research proposals, the objectives are where I see a lot of problems. I see objectives that are too vague to be useful, objectives that promise things that the methodology can never deliver, and objectives that do not actually connect to the aim which they're supposed to serve. In this video, I'm going to show you how to write research objectives that work. I'm going to break this down into 4 parts. First, I'll walk you through the key verbs, what each one promises and when to use it. Then I'll show you the research objective examples, a full set of working examples so you can see how all of this works in practice. Thirdly, I will cover 2 common practices I disagree with: SMART criteria or SMART research objectives, and embedding research methods into the objectives. Finally, I'll give you a quality check to ensure that your objectives actually serve your aim. Let's start with the verbs. Take the verb explore. When you say to explore, you're telling the reader that your approach is open-ended. You don't know what you will find. You are going to go in with a broad lens and you will let the data shape the findings. This is quite often a qualitative verb. It signals discovery, not confirmation, but it can also be used for exploratory surveys as well in quantitative studies. Identify is different. When you say to identify, you're saying that something specific exists and your job is to find it and name it. You're not wandering. You're searching for something in particular. Identify suggests more focus than explore and suggests that you would list whatever you find but not go into a lot of detail about them. To understand goes a lot deeper. When you say to understand, you are not just finding or naming something, you are interpreting it. You are getting beneath the surface. This is a strong qualitative verb, but it's a big promise. If you're going to understand something, your analysis needs to deliver genuine interpretive depth, not just a description of what is happening or what have you observed. Now, describe is more modest, and that is not a criticism. When you say to describe, you are telling the reader that you will characterize something clearly and thoroughly, but you are not claiming to explain why it happens. The problem arises when you use describe when you actually mean something more ambitious, or when you use something more ambitious when all you're doing is just describing. Know the difference. Determine is a very decisive verb. When you say to determine, you're saying that you establish something conclusively. This is more commonly used in quantitative research, and it signals that your data will give you a clear answer, not just an impression of what is happening. You also need to be incredibly specific when you talk about determine, and it quite often accompanies hypothesis testing. Compare is exactly like what it sounds. You're looking at 2 or more things side by side, examining the differences or similarities. What makes compare useful is that it forces you to be clear about 2 things: what you're comparing and on what basis you're comparing. That structure is built into the verb. You can't write to compare without specifying both sides. It works across both qualitative and quantitative approaches. You can compare themes in an interview data just as well as you can compare means in a data set. Assess or evaluate both imply a degree of judgment. You're not just finding or describing, you are weighing something against a standard or a set criteria. These standards or criteria are important because the verbs are about measuring the performance of something. You cannot arbitrarily assess or evaluate something. Use these when your research is designed to make a judgment call. Now, here's the important bit. Some verbs are too vague to be useful in an objective, and I see some of these in the proposals that I mark. Verbs like analyze, investigate, explain. At the end of the day, all of the data is going to be analyzed, so why is there a need to say that you're going to analyze something in an objective? Investigate has the same problem. It is what your whole study does. It is not specific enough to be one objective, but it might work for a research aim instead. And explain is a particularly dangerous verb in research because it implies causation, that you will show why something happens, and for most small-scale studies, especially qualitative ones, you are not designed to demonstrate causation. You can explore why something might happen, you can identify factors, but explain, that is a pretty big claim. Think of your research objectives verb as a contract. Each objective promises the reader one specific kind of output. The verb tells them what kind. As a marker, I will return to the objectives after reading the submission to see if they've indeed been achieved. I've put together a glossary of research objective verbs, what each one commits you to, and when to use it. You can download it for free from my website. The link is in the description. Let me use an example to show you how this works in practice. Imagine a study about asylum seekers' access to the NHS in the UK. One of the aims of this study might be to investigate the structural and logistical barriers that asylum seekers encounter when attempting to access NHS care. If I am writing objectives for that aim, I need to break it down, and I want to show you how different verbs change what each objective promises. Here are 4 objectives, each using a different verb. To explore asylum seekers' understanding of their entitlement to the NHS healthcare services. To identify the administrative and documentation barriers that prevent asylum seekers from registering with a GP. To describe geographical and logistical challenges asylum seekers face in physically accessing NHS facilities. To compare the registration processes across different types of NHS provision, GP practices, walk-in centres, A&E departments from the perspective of asylum seekers. Look at those 4 verbs. Explore, open-ended, discovery-oriented. We don't exactly yet know what they understood about the entitlement. Identify, we're searching for something specific that exists, namely administrative barriers. Describe, characterizing the challenge clearly, not explaining why the challenge happens. And compare, looking at different types of provisions side by side. Each verb is doing different work, and each objective is promising a different kind of finding, and together they cover the aim above them. We're just looking at structural and logistical barriers from different angles with different levels of specificity. And notice one more thing, every single objective still specifies the population and phenomenon. Asylum seekers in everyone, not just to identify administrative barriers, that could be about any stakeholder. Population, phenomenon, context, every time. This is what gives your objectives their anchoring, and this is what tells a marker that you know exactly who your research is about and what you're going to do with them, and there is a clear consistency across your objectives. I want to address 2 things that you might have been told to do with your research objectives that I personally don't agree with academically. Both of them come from well-meaning institutions, and I want to explain my reasoning. The first is SMART research objectives. Some institutions encourage students to write their research objectives using the SMART criteria, which stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. And this is an example of a SMART research objective. SMART was designed for organizational goal setting performance targets in companies, measuring whether or not a team is delivering what they say they would deliver by a particular date. In that context, it works very well. But research objectives work differently. Most research objectives simply do not carry elements like measurable or achievable within their phrasing. If not, they would be 4 or 5 lines long each. How measurable your findings are depends on your data collection and analysis methods. It is very difficult to glean measurability from just a verb that's being used, and practically impossible when it comes to qualitative research. Whether your research is achievable or realistic depends on your methodology, your resources, your access to participants, ethical considerations, and these are going to be detailed in your methods anyway. The timeliness is automatically assumed. Your objectives will be completed by the end of the research, as simple as that. You do not exactly need to write by the end of the research into every single objective. I find it very repetitive. The only element of SMART that genuinely matters for research objectives is specificity, and that I can completely agree on. Your research objectives should be specific enough that a reader knows exactly what you're promising to do. But the rest of the acronym is a business framework being applied in a research context where it doesn't really quite fit, and I think it's causing more confusion than clarity for new researchers. The second thing, and this is related, is the practice of embedding research methods into your objectives. The research objectives are the specific steps the study will take to fulfill its aim. While some institutions encourage this quite literally, asking students to demonstrate the measurability of their objectives or the steps of the research. So instead of writing to identify administrative and documentation barriers that prevent asylum seekers from registering for GP, they would write an objective like, to interview 5 to 8 GP practice managers or reception staff to identify institutional knowledge gaps, administrative bottlenecks, and gatekeeping friction points that occur during the registration process. Now that is very specific, and I can see the appeal of that. It feels very thorough. But here's the problem. You have just put your entirety of your methodology into your objective. Interview 5 to 8 GP practice managers, well, that's a method, a sample size, a participant type, and the rest of your proposal, specifically your methodology section, is going to cover all of that anyway. Which means the reader encounters your methods in the objectives and then encounters the same methods again in your methodology section. And instead of clarity, you've created repetition and potentially raised more questions because you are introducing elements that you have yet to cover. Remember that your objectives sit before your methods and after your literature review or your background. Worse than that, when every objective is 3 lines long because it has to specify the method, the sample, the analytical approach, the objective section then becomes very dense and very difficult to read. A reader, and I mean a marker, should be able to glance at your objectives and understand what your study does, not how it does it. The how belongs in the methodology. Now this brings me to the final piece, and this is less a framework and more of a quick quality check. Here are 3 things that I check when I'm marking. Number 1, do your objectives add up to your aim? Read your aim and then read your objectives. Do they cover what the aim is committed to? Does each objective serve one distinct aspect of the aim? This is not complicated, but you'll be surprised how often the answer is no. And when it's a no, the research then reads like 2 separate research studies stapled together. Check number 2, vocabulary consistency, particularly in how you describe your population and your phenomenon. Because here is what happens. A student writes an aim about asylum seekers, and then their objective refers to refugees, and then another objective mentions migrants. And now the marker is thinking, are these the same people? Are you studying asylum seekers specifically, or anyone that has migrated? Those are different populations and different experiences of the NHS. If you're not consistent, the reader doesn't know who your research is actually about. The same thing happens with the phenomenon. Your aim mentions experience, your objective says perception, another one says satisfaction. Those are not all the same thing. Experience is what happens to you, perception is how you see things, and satisfaction is whether or not you like it. If you use those words interchangeably, you are telling the marker that you haven't really thought about these things carefully, and this will cause you more confusion later in your methods. My rule is to pick your terms and use them consistently. Check number 3, splintering interests. This most often shows up in the objectives, and it is when your objectives start to pull the research in different directions that the aim did not signpost. Your aim is about structural barriers to NHS access, but one of your objectives suddenly wants to explore asylum seekers' mental health statuses. Another wants to compare NHS usage across different regions in the UK, for example. Individually, each objective might be interesting and related, but collectively they have stopped serving the aim. The research is now doing 3 things when it promised to do 1 according to your research aim. And this tells me as a marker that the student hasn't been very disciplined about the boundaries of their own study, or this study might potentially be bigger and more complicated than what the student is thinking. A load of your background and your literature review in your proposal should suggest why the research objectives are relevant to the aim of the research. So to prevent them from looking like it deviates from the aim, you need to establish the connections clearly in the background so that your interest in them, in the objectives, is more justified. Now I want to zoom out for a moment because making sure your objectives serve your aim, that's important, but it is also part of a larger picture that I've shown you earlier. Your research proposal is a chain. Your title needs to reflect your question, your methodology needs to match your objectives, your sample needs to be consistent with your population, your ethics needs to be coherent with your approach. If any one of those links is broken, the whole proposal will feel incoherent and the markers will start to notice. If you want to learn how to align the full research proposal from title all the way to its contribution and analysis, I've built an online course that walks you through exactly that. It covers every one of the elements of your proposal and how they connect, so the whole thing holds together as one coherent study. The link is in the description below. I also work one-on-one with students on their research design. If you have specific difficulties with your proposal, we can work through those too. My website is in the description as well. If you learned something from this video, give it a like, and if you want to make sure you don't miss any of my videos about academic tools and tips for postgraduate research students, make sure you're subscribed. Don't forget to grab the glossary or verb cheat sheet before you leave this video. I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye!